Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to all the organizations involved in making this happen, et cetera. So Martin Lawrenson, the co-founder, was also one of the co-founders of one of the biggest companies for the sale of automated banner ads in Sweden. So their background is in advertising, and this is also a time where, you know, mid 2000s, the music industry for years had been trying to figure out a way to deal with the impacts of file sharing on music industry revenues. The story of file sharing is very complicated. I'm someone who like factually wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Napster, because as a young person listening to music on the internet, it really like cracked open my own world, and my concept of like what music even is beyond mainstream music on the radio. So I could never, say that it was all bad in terms of the impact that file sharing had on culture. And in a lot of ways, I think that there were positive sides to it as well. So complicated story, but the music
Well, it's
industry.
called sharing. It's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
nice.
The music business, it was like, it's really funny, like when you look at kind of like the story of the music, of the impact of file sharing on the music business. Like in 1999, we made like over $30 billion from recorded music revenues. And by, 2014, it was boo-hoo, only $14 billion. Like, okay, it's still like a lot of money though in music. But trying to figure out ways to deal with the loss of revenue. So lots of companies before Spotify had tried music streaming. The major labels had tried and failed to launch their own streaming services as well. And it's interesting thinking about Sweden in particular, because I think, in some ways, Daniel Ek and Martin Lawrenson, observed that not just music, but media in general, the impact of file sharing made it so that consumers were kind of like becoming used to the experience of being able to open your computer and access whatever music or media you wanted to at the click of a few buttons. And also, the industry was looking for new revenue sources. At the time, though, the music business was really opposed to the idea of like free. Like any person who rolled up to their offices with a startup, they were trying to get licenses for some sort of platform that's going to provide free access to music. It was like an automatic no, because they were like, no, like free music is how we got in this mess, and we're trying to figure out someone who's going to solve this. But in Sweden, the culture of piracy was so different and so much more intense. For the book, I went to the first chapter you're talking about. While I was in Sweden, I interviewed someone who was involved in this organization called Pirat Baran, which stands for the Bureau of Piracy, and that people from that organization went on to start the Pirate Bay, which was, a kind of post-Napster file sharing service that existed based in Sweden, and the culture of piracy was like a lot more politicized in Sweden, particularly the group Pirat Baran formed in, first there was this group called Anti-Pirat Baran, which was a Hollywood-aligned lobbying group that was like an anti-piracy lobbying group. And the people in Pirat Baran, which is like this group of hackers and ravers and punks and people involved in underground music, were like, well, if you're a lobbying group, you're an anti-piracy lobbying group, we're a lobbying group too, but we're the pro-piracy lobbying group. And there was even like a pirate party, like a political party where candidates were running like on a platform around being pro-piracy. There's just like a different political edge to it, where there was more of this public discourse on like, well, is piracy bad for culture and society, or actually is this like access to culture that's happening through piracy actually like a good thing? So because of this, the music business decided that Sweden was a lost market. That's the phrasing that they used, and they were like, well, no one's ever going to buy music in Sweden again, so maybe we'll license this like free music app in Sweden because we have no other option there. So Spotify's original model was like access to a free library of streaming media supported by advertising, because they were ad tech guys. And if you listen to these early interviews with the co-founders, they're like, yeah, we had this idea for a way to deliver media and have it funded by ads. We knew the funding model was going to be advertising because that's what our background was, but we actually didn't know what the traffic source is going to be. So I think that's another really interesting detail too from the early days of Spotify, is that like music was kind of just a traffic source for this ad product they were developing. And if you listen to conference appearances, they talk about how they also thought about like, maybe the traffic source should be video, maybe it should be product search, maybe it should be audiobooks. So like kind of was almost like incidental that they ended up with music as the traffic source for their ad tech product.
Very encouraging.
Yeah. Who makes traffic sources?
Yes. Traffic source business, anyone? Well, you just you did just mention search, and I feel like that's a good segue into how Spotify initially conceived of a person's access to music through the platform. And it feels like it pretty quickly changed. Your book, I mean, the title is Mood Machine, and it seems like that evolved out of your research and reporting about how playlists and vibes became pretty crucial to Spotify's marketing. The research you did includes access to lots of internal documents and Slack chats from Spotify. How does Spotify as a company decide that this is how they're going to start to engineer the listening experience when they kind of start with more of like an open, just like, hey, I want to listen to the Pixies?
Yeah, so in the early days, all these streaming services were sort of more like search bars where you'd have to know what you wanted to go listen to, what artist or album. And, it's totally possible for people to still use these streaming services in these ways. But when I started researching Spotify in 2016, I was really interested in, I think from like a basic media literacy perspective, I was really interested in the front page, like when people open Spotify, what are they being shown and why, and kind of like how is that being influenced by different commercial considerations. So yeah, at that point in 2016, when you would open Spotify, it was mostly these like mood and vibe playlists. I mean, at that point, it would have been more mood playlists. I feel like vibe is kind of like more of a little later.
Yeah.
It's more mood playlists, mood and activity playlists. Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting trying to figure out how to like historicize this, because when I was writing the book, it was like a lot of the writing was happening in 2023. The concept of the Spotify playlist as like a cultural phenomenon really emerges in 2013, because that was the year that they hired their first in-house editorial team, started making Spotify owned and operated editorial playlists for the first time. So it was really only like a 10-year period, 2013 to 2023, that I was trying to like attempting to, mark out the major sort of turning points in how this way of packaging and selling music sort of evolved, and interviewed a lot of former employees in order to kind of like, get their perspective on what like the major shifts were, people who were close to the company. And yeah, one of the interviews that I did was really revealing. It was with someone who had worked close to the company in the late or early 2010s. And they talked to me about how, in the early days, Spotify sort of saw its product as maybe more in competition with iTunes, or, what they were offering was kind of the user experience of like a fully stocked iTunes library, but everything was streaming through the internet. But they eventually kind of like, it's kind of platform capitalism logic. Like they had to, from their perspective, like had to grow. All kind of the story of the platform era is just these companies just sort of pursuing relentless growth at all costs. So there's this sort of question of like, okay, how do we get past the early adopters? How do we like grow to a more mainstream audience? And how do we, get beyond just the music enthusiasts and get more of like the average radio listener, or, someone who's maybe using Pandora? How do we get that person on our platform? So according to someone I interviewed in 2012, they commissioned a research agency to study their own users and to sort of pinpoint, like, try to figure out how people were actually using their platform. And this research agency like got Spotify users to keep these detailed listening diaries, and then they sort of, charted out and through their study decided that people were more interested in a more Pandora-like lean-back experience. And then, according to this employee, they started optimizing more for the lean-back listener than the lean-forward listener. And it's kind of interesting, something I talk about in the book is how a lot of these tech companies, like, I think sometimes they make these strategic changes. They're just throwing a lot of stuff against the wall to kind of see what sticks. And maybe like they're not super like individually nefarious decisions to like, okay, we're gonna start like optimizing for the lean back listener. Like, the history of commercial radio is sort of like a history of lean back listening, like Pandora also part of the history of lean back listening. But it definitely kind of reflects this sort of like utter disregard for music, and it's kind of just like the pursuit of tactics of growth and engagement. It's like more of a marketing mindset than necessarily having anything to do with actually thinking, how can we build a tool that would serve musicians, that would serve listeners? It's like, no, how do we build a tool that hooks people on our platform, keeps them listening, gets them so they don't turn this app off, and like makes it so that they see value of it in their everyday lives by way of how much time they're spending on the platform.
Right. Time spent is the value metric.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and it's even interesting to chart the history of like when in like the trajectory of platform capitalism, like platforms started looking at time spent on a piece of media as the signal of like user satisfaction, because that's actually wasn't always the case. Like, there used to be more of a dynamic of like, if you thumbs up something, it meant you liked it. But at a certain point, some of these platforms started embracing this logic of like, if you spent a few more milliseconds on this, it means you must have liked it more than this other thing that you didn't spend those extra milliseconds on. It's like, behavioral data.
Yes, our unintentional signal to the algorithm of value. So I feel like you're just broached this idea of like these platforms are they're trying to grow, they're caught up in this growth model and expanding their audience. And I feel like one thing that I've observed, one of my big takeaways from your book is, independent music, which I think is like, you said yesterday, independent music is like all music, really. But like for our purposes, it's like music that kind of exists outside the mainstream. Independent music has this entire infrastructure that's been built out over decades. It means like that in order to exist and thrive, there's like an ecosystem that supports these artists and record labels. It's like, distribution channels, touring circuits, a media environment, an ecosystem. And it strikes me that kind of when streaming comes along, suddenly everybody sort of gets wrapped up in this idea of infinite scale and infinite growth, and there's like this huge opportunity now because we now have this platform, this new platform that can suddenly somehow communicate with everybody in the whole world. They all have access to our music, and we can maybe reach beyond our little sphere of influence. Did indie music bet on the wrong horse here? What happened?
I mean, something that I really tried to do in researching this book, like the story of streaming and its impact on music has been told several times already through the lens of pop music or the influence on major label music. And I think that the influence on independent music has been told less frequently. Specifically, even like, the major contracts that, in order for something like Spotify to exist, Spotify has to sign these contracts with the major rights holders to get the permission to have the material on their platform and the licensing agreements to get everyone paid for it. So when they launched the music that they launched with was music from Universal Music Group, Warner Music Group, Sony Music Entertainment, EMI. At the time, there were 4 major labels. Corporate consolidation, there's only 3 now. But then they also had music from these 2, independent. Well, one, the Orchard, just like an independent distributor that's actually owned by a major label, but then also this organization called Merlin Group, or Merlin Network is what it's called, and that's this entity that represents the rights of tens of thousands of independent record labels, and in some ways is like quite useful because it negotiates on behalf of all those labels to be able to kind of like leverage more negotiating power with digital service providers. So DSP being the industry jargon for streaming service, in negotiating with companies like Spotify. But I was always struck by this, like, how come on the day Spotify launched, they had all this Merlin Network music? Like, why did independent record labels think this was a good idea? Especially because the business model was so confusing, and also seeing how poorly independent artists have fared. You always, in the streaming era, constant stream of no shortage of anecdotes of independent musicians talking about their royalty statements they get, like, like for the past year of streaming, I got like 36 cents, or I got like, not even enough money to buy a cup of coffee, even though I had thousands of streams. Because the average streaming rate being there's not really a exact average streaming rate that you could point to, but many artists over the years have reported an average of around like 0.0035 cents per stream being, what is anecdotally reported. So trying to unpack that a little bit was super interesting. Like, I guess in some ways it was kind of like right place in the right time, because by the time Spotify arrived, the independent record labels through Merlin Network had very recently been burned by companies like MySpace, who, like, MySpace was really integral to the independent music scene for years. And then in the early mid 2000s, MySpace launched a streaming service called MySpace Music, but they only launched with major label material and did not seek out like licenses with independent record labels in the same way. So a lot of the independent record labels were like, why don't these digital companies take us seriously? Like, we're important, we bring value to your product. And then there's also this thing called e-music. It also, that like a similar kind of thing, they had struck deals with all the major labels, and all of the independent labels were like, why don't they take us seriously? There's also this other thing where it was like the mid 2000s. It was kind of, in the book I talk about like Obama era techno optimism, where like, independent record labels, I think, like, took a lot of pride in being like open to new technologies. There was still this sense of tech optimism about the idea that tech platforms actually were going to be these democratizing forces for culture, and actually maybe this is really going to end up being better for independent music than the old school gatekeepers of commercial radio and major record labels. And that was kind of the narrative that they were really pushing. This is going to level the playing field. What wasn't as clear, I think, to a lot of independent musicians, and even to some of the independent record labels who were working with Merlin Network, was just the extent to which the major labels were partners with Spotify. Like, when Spotify launched, the 3 major record labels owned 17% of the company. So how can you have a level playing field for independent music when the company is literally owned by the major labels, and they actually, it turns out, had negotiated better rates for themselves that independent artists and independent labels weren't able to negotiate? And, just as I tried to chart out in the book and document, also, like, it's not just a question of having your music be accessible on these platforms, but also then, like, okay, can you get access to the curators? Can you have your music be algorithmically surfaced? Like, can the music be actually delivered to people who want to hear it? And as it turns out, if you're not a major record label, it's actually really hard to reach those people who are, holding the power in a curatorial sense.
Yeah, I feel like we've kind of culturally internalized this idea that the internet is this democratizing place, this and the technology affords us access to audience, and in that ideal situation, it's some manner of like meritocracy, where like, if you do a great song, man, you can find a hit. But I just kept coming up against like these examples from your book that suggest like, oh no, it is not a level playing field. The deck is very much stacked against independent artists in particular. You just mentioned that the major labels are straight up part owners of the platform. How are some other ways where like these independent artists are essentially, I mean, to my mind, they're sort of like subsidizing this platform in a lot of ways?
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say the exact stake that the majors have in Spotify has gone down over the years. At least one of the majors has basically cashed out all their shares, and then as other like institutional owners have got involved, now the majors own like less than 10% of Spotify, but they still own like that's a pretty big part of the company, all things considered. Um, yeah, okay, so how else is it not a level playing field beyond just this institutional ownership? I mean, one being that like the company likes to kind of talk about the playlist ecosystem as this like data-driven meritocracy, but anecdotally, like if you talk to people, it just still seems like the most direct way of getting an artist's music onto an official streaming playlist is just knowing the curators. And the major labels, like on one hand, they have so much more marketing muscle. And because if you're a streaming service, like in order for that product to be a viable product, the idea that someone could open an app and search for any song that could pop off the top of their head from across the history of popular recorded music, you need to have not only major labels like agreeing to keep renegotiating their contracts, but also like to be happy with the service and to feel like these services are like a partner to them. So from my perspective, it seems like there's a certain type of class of artists who gets considered a partner, being artists that are on major record labels and also some big indie labels too. And then there's another type of artist that gets viewed as a customer, where it's not like, you're not like a partner, you are a consumer of our artist tools. So there's a whole other, one of the reasons why the book is broken up into looking at on one side, like the impact on the listener, and on the other side, the impact on the artist, is because when Spotify talks about its product and pitches it to investors, gives updates on their shareholder calls, and like when Spotify pitches itself to the advertising industry, they talk about their product as a two-sided marketplace. Like, on one side, they're selling a product to the listener subscriptions, and then the other side, they're selling a product to musicians. So they're selling promotional opportunities like banner ads, pop-ups. Like if you ever opened a streaming app and gotten a pop-up that's like, your favorite artist has a new album coming out. One, don't click that, because if you click it, your favorite artist is getting charged 45 cents if you click it. and also discovery mode, which I mentioned in the introductory reading, but these programs where artists get the opportunity to accept a lower royalty rate in exchange for algorithmic promotion, that's considered part of marketplace. So like marketplace is the umbrella under which all of these artists facing products are sold. So the banner ads, the sponsored shelves, the algorithmic promotion, etc. And yeah, it's just like bleak.
It's bleak. Whew. It is. It's tough out there for artists, guys. And but I will say I left this book feeling positive, because maybe it's so bleak. It's sort of like for independent music, there's sort of like nowhere to go but up, right? And I feel like we're in a position now where there will be a lot of interesting activity, especially kind of at a local level, where we have to figure out kind of new systems for how to, as artists, for how to build an audience, to engage an audience, to build community. I just think that that's a fun playground to be in, that's somewhat divorced from this having these tech companies sort of mediate your relationship. Can you tell us about some of the sort of interesting things you're seeing ongoing, like more from an artist perspective, that might be like pushing back on like, hey, this isn't the only only avenue for us, or or what is in the artist's court right now? Because there's not a whole lot of cards left in the deck, but what do we have?
Yeah. So something that is really interesting is that when I first started writing about streaming 2016, 2017, something that I came up against a lot was a lot of musicians who did not want to talk about this subject on the record because, on one hand, they were really afraid of backlash from streaming services. Especially the mid 2010s was this period where the concept of the official Spotify editorial playlist had a lot more influence over how people discovered music. Now, as a lot of music discovery actually has become even more like algorithmic and personalized via these personalized feeds, the influence of these editorial playlists in some ways has like kind of a little bit diminished. But at that point, a lot of artists were like, I can't talk publicly about my experiences with streaming because, one, like my manager and my label be really mad at me, but also like could be risk like being taken off of Spotify playlists. Because I was hearing things from artists about like they would speak out about their experiences with Spotify or even other streaming services on social media, and they would literally like get contacted by the streaming service, or their teams would like inquiring about what they were saying. And in some cases, I definitely have talked to artists over the years who, hard to prove, and sometimes you can feel a little bit like conspiracy brained or whatever, but people who are involved in like these ongoing artist organizing projects who speak out about their experiences with streaming services, and they're like, yeah, I've never been on an official editorial playlist ever. It's the kind of person where you're like that's weird that you've never been on an official editorial playlist, but it also kind of checks out because you speak honestly about the music business on social media or whatever. So in the early years of reporting this, a lot of artists not interested in talking. If they did, they wanted to be anonymous or under a pseudonym. And now I feel like that's like really changed. Now like people are like, we have nothing to lose, and it's way more important to have a collective voice as artists than it is to like get the 1,000, 2,000 streams you might get from being on like indie chill dinner vibes or whatever. Like they're like actually being part of this like musicians union and taking part in signing this letter, like any type of campaign action matters more. So there's a chapter of the book called The New Music Labor Movement, towards the end of the book, that focuses on this organization called United Musicians and Allied Workers, and their campaign that they launched in 2021 called Justice at Spotify, where they organized, a pretty large amount of musicians in cities all over the world. I mean, all over the United States and a few places in Europe and maybe one other place, to do these protests outside of Spotify offices, because Spotify has offices all around the world. And yeah, they like organized these protests, and they came up with this list of demands, things that would make streaming more fair to artists. So like their demands were pay us a penny per stream, and payola practices, be transparent about the terms of contracts, which the contracts that exist between streaming services and record labels and other rights holders are completely walled off by NDAs. So there's very few people who have ever reviewed them. There's one contract that was leaked in 2015, a contract between Sony and Spotify. My really big hope is that by writing this book that someone else will leak me a contract at some point, but it's yet to happen. Music streaming book at proton.me. So what other demands were they making? Credit labor in recordings. So like streaming services are really bad about like making credits easily accessible, which is wild because it's completely technologically possible to have really robust systems for tracking crediting. And some other demands, and they organized these protests, and they also printed off these demands and put them in envelopes and delivered them to the front desks of Spotify offices. And in more recent years, this group has also worked on this bill called the Living Wage for Musicians Act that they worked on with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib's office, and it introduces a new type of compensation that would go directly. It would be generated from essentially a tax on advertising revenue on streaming services, create a new pool of revenue that would go directly to the musicians and not flow through the rights holders and record labels. So that would be really
That
interesting. And
already
helpful.
exists in radio.
Exactly, yeah. It's
But-
based on pre-existing precedent for digital radio.
Yeah, but there's nothing. We've had no laws governing streaming ever.
Yeah. Yeah, no. And in terms, also, I should say, like, so in terms of like the regulatory conversation and ways that you could kind of like do some governmental intervention, other countries also are starting to do
Good
this
luck
too.
to us.
Yeah, good luck to us. But you know, it's kind of depressing actually, because in the book, when I was writing the book in 2023, mostly, it was a time when it actually, like, I have a couple pages where I talk about things that the FTC could do to kind of like, you know, force the streaming companies and the labels to hand over their contracts so there could be FTC oversight of the contracts that exist between these services, things the FTC could do around digital payola. And in 2023, that really seemed possible because there was a cool, relatively cool person like leading the FTC at the time who maybe seemed interested in this.
Yeah, and there was like an anti-monopoly sort of thread going through the Labor Department.
Yeah, so maybe in terms of like our country, maybe check back in like 4 years. But other countries, so Canada has something that was implemented relatively recently where there's a, you know, it's called like the streaming tax. It's like a new tax that is put on streaming services that creates a new pool of money that is specifically dedicated to funding. They say it's funding Canadian content, but it's basically like grants for musicians and podcasters, and you know, it's so, you know, it makes so much sense. Like, tax the streaming services and create new types of public funding for musicians. And there's also another European country, maybe France, that has something like that too. So there's like examples of things that people are, and there's also like other ongoing legislative battles being fought in the UK and other parts of Europe around different types of ways of getting new streams of money from the streaming services to musicians, to session musicians, to different people involved in the music making process. So,
and that can trickle down to US-based artists if they're getting streamed in the UK. That money can filter back depending on what the rules are. But
yeah.
I've seen that personally, and
Yeah.
I get certain money from different countries, and like, oh, interesting. Okay.
So
all right.
I will say, though, the end of the book, I call the end of the book Reform and Revolution.
Yeah.
So there's like a part of the book that's focused on like ways in which artists, organizations, labor organizing could hold streaming services accountable, try to like get some more money in the pockets of artists through the pre-existing streaming services, but then also, obviously, coming from the worlds of independent music and DIY cultural production, that would not be a sufficient enough ending to the book. We also need to imagine alternatives entirely outside of the corporate music industry from the ground up that are built with artists' interests in mind, with more participatory structures, give artists a say, and not just like in the governance of these platforms too.
Right.
So.
They're not just your content.
Yeah.
I know we're getting close to time, and I want to have some questions. How do you feel about doing a quick lightning round?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Rate with the percentage chance you think this has of happening in the next 5 years. The Living Ways for Musicians Act gets passed by Congress.
100%.
Oh, really? Oh, so
No,
optimistic.
we have to believe that to be
Okay,
true.
thank you.
We
Thank
have to.
100%.
Yeah.
Okay, Spotify gets overrun by AI and fake music, not just the ghost music that you talk about in your book that's actually created by humans, but straight up AI music.
What does overrun mean? Because there's
Overrun.
already
Over 50%.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely 100%.
100%. What is the likelihood that people don't even know or care that that happens?
Oh, 80. I was gonna say 50 because I think people already do care like about this. Like I've every week I get emails from people with links to Spotify tracks saying, "Can you let me know if this is AI or not?" And it's just like, people. I think people really do care.
Yeah.
So this is something that streaming executives say is about like the way in which ghost music and stock music and AI music could supplant real musicians on streaming services. They say the average listener doesn't know and doesn't care. And I think that actually it might be true that they don't know, but I think that you can't tell whether or not people care if you don't give them the ability to know. So
Okay.
I'm like a really big proponent of music made with generative AI having to be labeled, and also any track that is being recommended due to a commercial deal. So in the book, there's a big investigation into this practice of filling instrumental music playlists with music by basically what I call ghost artists. So like these certain tracks from these production companies that are licensed under special deals and basically released. They're made by session musicians and released under monikers for like artists that don't exist. So like fake music. I think that should be labeled. I think anything that is being surfaced due to these like institutionalized payola practices should be labeled, because if it's labeled, then it's like people can decide for themselves. Like maybe they don't want to listen to generative AI music. Right. Like they,
It'd be easy to just make a playlist. Spotify could engineer a playlist that's like non-generative AI playlist, mood, vibes, breakfast, sad girl.
Yeah.
Continuing the lightning round.
Yes, sorry, that wasn't very lightning.
Spotify gets bought by a larger tech company like Apple or Amazon. I put that in for you, Kelly.
Yeah. 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 I don't know.
Pretty low is what you're saying.
Yeah.
You don't have to explain it. It's the lightning round.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I generally resist answering that question because
Okay.
like I'm not, something that I try really hard to do is not be in the business of future casting.
Okay.
Well,
this is exactly what I'm asking you to do here, Liz.
But yeah, I would say it seems pretty low. It seems pretty low to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should I discontinue this?
No,
Okay.
keep going. It's fine.
How about this one? A union of independent musicians and labels pulls music from Spotify.
Yeah, that seems pretty high to me.
Okay. I'm taking that as a win. An alternative tech-based ecosystem emerges to provide a new interface for music and achieves significant scale.
So like any kind of new platform?
Any kind.
Yeah, that seems pretty high to me too.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Is the new system good or bad for artists?
Well, yeah, I feel like it's like without any kind of intervention, it seems like, tech companies are in pursuit of content that they can deliver for the lowest cost possible. And I think that there are people that will continue that pursuit, like the generative AI companies for sure will continue that pursuit. But I also am like, there's so many people working on more artist-friendly alternative platforms right now. There's like a bunch of people working on cooperative alternatives to streaming and Bandcamp right now. And
It feels
I'm
like
really
the
intrigued by
tech's
that.
pretty easy to figure out at this point.
Yeah.
And so it's just a matter of like harnessing this energy, and that's why I left the book feeling rather positive, is because like, oh, the tech's here. It's been around like a decade. We can figure this out in a more equitable, artist-friendly way. And so I felt encouraged by it.
You were at my Providence book talk. So at my Providence book talk, the person that interviewed me with like 3 days notice was like, how do you feel about me bringing the spare server I have to the event? And I'll just real quick code a light browser-based streaming service for local music, and we can just like post on Instagram tonight asking local musicians to submit their music, and we can just like launch a local music streaming server at your event in like 3 days. And I was like, Yeah, cool. Sounds good. And then he did it.
He did
you
it.
know. And then like at the
The house
event,
music was
the
the
house,
streaming
yeah,
server.
yeah. So I'm like, it's not that hard to technically, literally create the technology of a streaming service, and there is open source software out there. I know actually something that's really interesting is going around. You'd be surprised how many people, maybe there's even someone in this room who does this, like have their MP3 collections and they actually like create their own streaming services and servers in their houses so that they can stream their own music from their own server that they have at home. You do that?
Oh, you got me, Liz.
Okay. See, there's probably someone in the room. Yeah.
Plex, just look it up. It's pretty easy, very
Plex,
easy
yeah,
to do.
that's what I've been hearing about a lot.
Okay, the last bit, I really like when Ezra Klein does this on his podcast. He asks his interview subjects to recommend 3 books. But since we're talking about recommendations and how that works in the digital sphere, I want to get personal recommendations from Liz Pelly. What are 3 albums you'd like to recommend to us today?
Oh, wow, just 3 albums?
Just
in
3 albums, 3
general?
things you think are great.
Okay, let me think.
Take notes. Everybody's got their notes app out. That's good. And file in. Yeah.
Oh my God, 3 albums from just like across music history?
Yeah. It could be your friend's band, whatever. I don't.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have given you the heads up on that one.
Wow, so much pressure.
Asking these absolutely hard-hitting questions about like how the intricacies of Spotify works, and no problem, off the cuff.
Yeah, okay, I'm just thinking, because it has to be good balance, you know?
Okay.
The Raincoats, self-titled
Great.
record.
Yeah.
Lucinda Williams, Car Rolls on a Gravel Road.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the last one gonna be? The Shack's Philosophy of the World.
Okay. Great.
Those are my 3 recommendations.
Okay, we're gonna do like 10 minutes of questions here. Who's got questions? Raise a hand. Caulfield.
I'm interested in Spotify's sort of data aggregate dreams and why are they tracking data? What are they looking for? I don't think that they're very good cultural historians or even just stewards of music history. Like when you go through bands, some have biographies, some have credits, some don't. When Spotify revives a genre like slowcore, it erases regional differences, erases historical differences. I won't say anything about aesthetic differences, but at the same time, I think this company's really interested in making a high-resolution map of how all these different microgenres, say from speed metal to cloud rap, how they maybe interact. And I'm definitely thinking about Glenn, who's the Every Noise at Once guy who was fired. What is Spotify tracking? What is what is their picture of music data and musical difference?
Yeah. I have, been fascinated by that. So, what's being referenced is for years, Spotify employed a principal engineer whose main project was creating this map of like 6,000 microgenres. So studying all of the listening behavior on Spotify, making this list of microgenres, and then it's interesting to think about, like why did they do this and what were their goals? Because clearly, like you mentioned, it wasn't like an archival purpose. They're not interested in making it easy. They have all this data. It's like, why don't they use all that data to make it easier to like track independent record labels and like follow these actually interesting strands of contextualizing culture and learning about music. Why is it that you can't like go to a track and look at who played on this and then click their name and see everything else that they played on? Because I feel like they're not really interested in using all this data to sort of like map out music history or to do anything that would illuminate the labor that goes into making music. Their data map is basically just a way of generating data. Like the words themselves that describe the music are a form of data that are used in their recommendation algorithms. So those words, when you see your Spotify Wrapped and it's like, your favorite genre was, what's the famous one that they always confuses people? What? Bubble grunge is one of them. Yeah, that's a good example. Okay, so like, your favorite genre last year was bubble grunge, like a lot of these weird micro genres, and people screenshot it and they're like, haha, like, isn't this funny? Like, you just did free marketing for Spotify, by the way, like posting, every time, like so they use these wacky micro genres to basically like fuel their algorithms. You need data in order for like algorithmic systems to function, algorithmic recommendation system to um, uh, function. I have this chapter in my book called self-driving music that is a phrase that one of the co-presidents of Spotify used to describe like their sort of like vision of their app in the future. Like, you'll just be able to open the app and not need to put any input in. It'll just be self-driving music. Music will be self-organizing because we have all this data on listening. But I think also they use the micro genres in more recent years, like just to throw a bunch of them at users and hope that they think it's like funny enough that they'll screenshot it and post it on their Instagram story. That's definitely what Daylist was. They're like, okay, what can we do with these weird micro genres? Like, let's throw them over like a gradient and like give them to you a few times a day and hope that you like tweet about it, because that's like more free marketing for us.
Okay, can I do this person with the blonde hair?
Now that Epic bought Bandcamp a few years ago, it's like we're waiting for the shoe to drop on Bandcamp becoming like significantly worse.
Yeah.
How worried are you about something like that happening? I guess because to me Bandcamp is like the biggest platform for listeners who care a little bit more about the music, want to maybe spend more on the music, and then in more independent labels and artists who release there. And then do you think any sort of new platform, you're talking about some cooperative ones, are those inevitably going to be looked at by big tech as like targets to capture, as maybe they don't have to do any R&D anymore because they can wait for some new one to come and then pick them up, like how Epic did with Bandcamp?
Yeah. As it stands, it's interesting, like Bandcamp, as it stands, kind of remains the easiest to when people are like, well, where should I get my music if not Spotify? Like, the easiest thing is still just saying, well, you should buy music on Bandcamp or go listen to music on Bandcamp. I feel like they've lost a lot of their goodwill in recent years as they sort of have like changed hands between different corporate owners. So just maybe to explain, because sometimes people don't even know what Bandcamp is. It's a marketplace where any musicians can upload their albums, set your own price, and sell your music directly to your fans. And there's also some interesting social features where you can kind of like follow people and get recommendations based on what your friends are buying. And they also have a pretty robust editorial arm where they, over the years have hired music journalists to write scene profiles and do interviews with bands, album of the day. But yeah, a few years ago, this company that has had so much goodwill amongst the independent music community for years and years and been like the kind of go-to alternative, first got sold to Epic Games, the company that makes Fortnite, right? No, Minecraft. Is it Fortnite? Okay, yeah. I don't know anything about games, but I think people were like, "Oh, that's weird. Like, why did they do that?" Like, still confusing, to be honest. Then it wasn't. I think Epic Games also was like, "Why did we do that?" Because they sold the company pretty shortly after to this company called Song Trader that is kind of like a like similarly in the space of like library music and production music, I think. Someone else might know more than me. So a lot of people in independent music are like, oh no, like what does it mean for this beloved independent music marketplace to be like kind of just being tossed around by different corporations? Also, there was like this, they laid off a bunch of staff. There was this union busting campaign, which also really contributed to like the loss of goodwill. So in some ways, for the independent music community, I think actually this question of Bandcamp sustainability is almost more consequential because so many independent artists rely on it for income. Bandcamp, unlike streaming services, if you buy music from someone on that platform, like in 24 hours, like 85 to 90% of the fee is PayPal to the artist directly. It's a way more equitable model. But also, like, is the tech company too, and artists also report feeling platform pressures of Bandcamp as well. So yeah, more consequential. There are a lot of people working on cooperative alternatives to Bandcamp right now, and I think that it is a good idea for people who care about independent music to like the cool thing about a lot of these alternatives, cooperative alternatives. So like there's this thing called Tone.audio. There's another thing called Subvert.fm, and there's one called Merlot. And as far as I know, those are like the 3 cooperative alternatives to Bandcamp that people are working on right now. What's cool about them is you can participate in them. So I feel like it's definitely worth like experimenting if people are interested and
Time
getting
is
involved.
now.
You can join their discords and kind of like, be involved in helping shape these platforms.
Okay, the person in front of, yeah. Yep, that's you.
Thank you for your talk. Really cool to hear from someone who really researched it. My question to you is, I guess the enshittification cycles, I feel like are so fast these days, and I feel like it's an inevitability. And do you think Spotify will, or I guess what kinds of enshittification will happen to Spotify? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that enshittification being this sort of like word that evokes the concept of like platform decay. So as these platforms get bigger over time, just the quality of the material circulating on them, the types of conversations happening just sort of like decays and becomes sort of like garbage. um, I think that the thinking about like platform decay as it relates to streaming services, there's a tendency to automatically thinking about like generative AI content and generative AI music flooding these services and what implications that's going to have for musicians and listeners. I'm also really interested though in like platform decay as it relates to how we contextualize music and understand it, not just the music itself, but like the types of ways, like I would say that Spotify's AI DJ, from my perspective, is like a sign of platform decay, that they're pushing this idea of normalizing people clicking on this one button and getting algorithmic recommendations spliced together with this generative AI voice trained on one of their employees. That seems like also a form of garbage as well, especially as like a music journalist and a critic who like, I really think that the way that we contextualize music and present it and the way in which we sort of like, suggest that music has meaning is important. Yeah, one of the one of the quotes from my book reporting that haunted me the most as a music journalist was this one former Spotify employee who told me that the whole point of their playlist apparatus and their recommendation system is to reduce the cognitive work that a user has to do when they open the app. And I think that's the goal of a lot of AI systems, right? Reducing cognitive work, which basically is like, we want you to think less. That's like what reducing cognitive work is. And from my perspective, criticism, I think of the idea of criticism as like code word for thinking. And I don't know, I feel like we should be thinking about ways in which we can contextualize music and present it and recommend it to people that will actually encourage them to think about music. And, not to mention I think this is sort of like a broader conversation right now with generative AI and the way it's impacting critical thinking skills. And, some say that is like an alarmist. Some say it's like one of the most pressing issues of our times. I say it's probably a pretty important consequence of generative AI and AI in general to be grappling with right now.
Maybe one more question. Okay. Oh boy, there's so many good questions. When we're done, Liz will hang out and you can get book signed. I'm gonna go here.
I'm down.
For the book, was there any artists that you talked to in that major or underground or indie that you referenced? And then two, I was wondering, I don't know, I mean, most people know. I don't know if you who Prince is, because I seen the documentary when all that stuff, all the stuff got happening.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, maybe in the future, do you think the tables might turn over where artists kind of advance more, then that way we don't have to depend on certain things to get out there?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. It's just
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, well, so the first question was like about musicians that were interviewed for the book. Yeah, I interviewed a lot of musicians for the book. It's kind of like an important part of the research process for me, or this is like a reporting project, is making sure that there are a lot of voices of musicians included, independent musicians. I think I interviewed one major label musician, and actually it didn't make it into the final cut, but it's mostly, it wasn't on purpose, it was actually kind of by accident. It was mostly independent artists, and some who have done really well in the streaming era, and some who, have really struggled in the streaming era. It's kind of like a spectrum. And then a lot of artists who have really high streaming numbers, but then also like have struggled with the platform in other ways. Like I have a whole section in my book about like people who make lo-fi hip hop beats to study and relax to, which is like a genre of instrumental like hip hop beats that has become really popular in the streaming / YouTube era. And these are artists who are like, actually some of them making a lot of money from streaming, but have other issues where they feel different pressures because their livelihoods is so wrapped up in people passively listening to the work they make through these curation channels that they have no control over. So anyway, lots of artists' voices. And then, yeah, in terms of like the tables turning, I mean, I do think that I always believe that there's potential for artists. Like something that I'm inspired by is like the resourcefulness of musicians, and also like inventiveness of underground and independent and DIY musicians. The history of independent music is people looking at unfair circumstances and figuring out ways to build infrastructure that works better for their own creative communities through encouraging, like participation, and also like staring at systems that don't serve them and then not waiting for the tools to be handed to them and then creating the tools that they need that work better for them. So like, if that's to be instructive in any way, or if we're to like take anything from the concept of independent music, one of my like other sort of like research interests is like, what does it mean to be independent in the streaming era? Or like, does that hold up as a framework for thinking about interrogating power and culture anymore? But if there's anything to be learned from it, I think it's just like the power of kind of creating your own systems and networks when the ones that exist aren't serving you and your communities. So
And that's where we're going to end, because it's perfect. Perfect, because that's why I invited you here, was because I wanted to start that conversation locally. I wanted to involve all of our great sponsors. Thank you again to Lawrence Public Library, Raven Bookstore, Love Garden Sounds. If you want to think more critically about local music, go out and support it and buy records from artists and support it financially, support it with your attention. Come to a land show or go to a Lawrence Music Alliance meetup. That's how we get it done, folks. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Liz.
thank you so much.
Raven has Liz's book for sale in the back, and she'll stick around and sign things. Thank you so much.